So welcome back again. In this lesson, we're going to talk about a UI popover presentation. And that's essentially a kind of segue that makes one view controller to appear over the other one. Although it is possible to use UI popovers in iPhone, we use them primarily for iPad interfaces because there's more space and you can actually see where it is appeared on top of the other view controller. So let's go ahead into Xcode and develop one and get a sense of how we do that. I'm going to start a new application. I'm going to call it UI Popover app. And then the moment my UI Popover app loads, I'm going to change the simulator type to be iPad. Any type of iPad would do. For now, I'm just going to leave it at iPad 6th generation. And the next thing I need to do, I'm going to head into the storyboard. And in here, I'm going to assume that I have my view shown as an iPad view, something like that. And then in here, I'm going to assume that I have a button. So let's have a button. I'm going to place it maybe here, right in the center, actually. Let me zoom into it a little bit more. Get rid of that. So here is my button, and the button, I'm going to give it a different background color, maybe like that, and it says tap to pop. And the thing I want to happen is I want to press this button. I want a UI popover to appear, and once that one appears, I want to have something in there that changes a value in my main view controller, which is this one. So to do that, the first thing I need is I need a new view controller. So I'm going to go in here, say I have a new view controller. And this new view controller, I'm actually going to go to the attributes of it and say its size is not inferred, it's rather a freeform one. So I can actually go in here in the dimensions and manually change its size. Say the size is maybe 300 by 300. So I make it a much smaller view controller because I don't want it to cover the entire screen. So this new view controller, maybe I make its background to be the same color, something like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and say from my button, tap to pop, I'm going to make a segue to here. And that segue is actually going to be of the type present as popover. So now I have that segue that presents this view controller as a popover. And if I select my segue, I can see that I have this set as a popover. There are directions that I will talk to you about in a second. And I'm going to give it an identifier as well. I'm going to say my segue ID. Now, we could actually run the application right now and see what we get. And let's do that just so that we get a sense of what happens up until this point if we just have a segue of the type UI popover presentation with a view controller that is smaller than the regular size. If I tap on here, we see that my view controller appears here on the top left corner, and it doesn't really stay true to the values that we suggested, the values of being 300 by 300 pixels. So let's go ahead and modify all of these things manually so we know exactly where it is going to show up and we know exactly what size is going to have. So to do that, I'm going to go to my view controller, and in my view controller, I need to call for a method that is preparing for segues, because this is after all another segue. So I'm going to say prepare for segue, and in my prepare for segue, I'm going to go ahead and say if segue dot identifier was that ID. Of course, you don't really have to do that because in here we only have one segue, but in a real application you might have multiple one of those. So I'm going to do it for now. But if you only had one segue, then you don't need to bother with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say let's call it VC, and we have to get the segue.destination view controller, and we have to make that of a certain type simply because we don't know what is the type of this view controller. So for that, I'm going to actually have to make a new view controller class. I'm going to say command N. That's going to be a Cocoa Touch class of the type UI view controller. And I'm going to call that pop view controller. So I have a view controller that's called pop view controller. I don't want anything in here actually. I want to get rid of everything. And what I want to do is I want to go to my storyboard and assign that to be the class for the little view controller. So for this view controller, it's actually called pop view controller. So we got that part taken care of. Now I'm going to go back to the view controller and say, in the preparation for segue, get the VC to be as pop view controller, because I know it is going to be of that type anyway. Now, the next thing I need to do is I need to find a content size for this pop view controller. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's have a VC, and I'm going to say preferred content size. I'm going to say that is a CG size of 300 and 300, the numbers that we wanted. So we're setting those values to be exactly 300 by 300. Now, so far everything we have done has been on setting the view controller itself. We haven't done anything on the popover controller, the controller that actually makes sure your view appears on top of another view. So to do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and say let, and I'm going to call it controller. I'm going to say that becomes VC, popover view presentation controller. So I essentially find the popover presentation controller of this view controller, and then I'm going to say controller dot delegate, which is of the type UI popover presentation controller delegate to be self. And since I'm delegating to here, I obviously have to have that protocol conform to. So I'm going to say it's called the UI popover presentation controller delegate. So I conform to that delegate as well. And now I can actually change the settings of this controller. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say controller dot source view. It becomes self.view. So it appears from this view controller. So the next thing I want to set is I want to set in which direction does the controller actually appear. So I'm going to go in here and say controller dot permitted arrow directions becomes a UI popover arrow direction dot up. And that essentially means that I want my UI popover to appear at the bottom of something, whatever that triggers it, in this case being my button. Now, the next thing is actually quite important and somehow tricky, and that's about where do you want the arrow to appear, and based on that, everything else finds its place. So that's essentially called controller dot source rect. And the source rect is essentially the location where you want the arrow to appear from. Let me first show you what I mean by that, and then I'm gonna, play around with the numbers so you can see it a little bit better. So I'm gonna say it is a CG rect, and it's got all of these 4 values. I don't want its width and height to have any value, so there's 0 and 0, so there's just one location. For the X of it, I'm going to say let it be in the center of the button that is calling it. So for that, I'm going to actually have to get my sender and say here, let's just put it in a button. So let's say my button becomes sender as UI button, because I know it is a button anyway. So I'm going to say get the button. From the button, I want to find its center, and its center, I want to get X of it. So that is the location that I want for the X, and I want the very same thing or a very similar thing for the Y. So I want the source rect to appear from the center of my button in both X and Y, and they don't have any width or heights with them. Let's go ahead and run this application up until now, and then we get a better sense of what this source rect is actually doing. So now that my app is on, if I tap on here, you will see that the arrow actually appears from the center of this button. And that is essentially what this source rect means. If I wanted the arrow to appear on the lower left corner of the button, I would say my button dot frame dot origin dot x, that is the X of it. And then I would go ahead and say for the Y of it, make it my button center Y, and then I would add the height of my button to it as well. I would say plus my button dot bounds dot height. So I would add that much to it. Let me get a little better space in here, And then even for the Y of it, I would actually put the origin of it. So this essentially means the top left corner in terms of the Y plus the height of the button, which essentially translates into the lower left corner. Let's see if that is true. It should show me the popover in the lower left corner of the button now when the application runs. So now when I tap in here, I will see that it appears from the lower left. I don't know if you can see the arrow. It has a white little thing which is a little difficult to see. What I could do is I could actually change my background color so we could see that one a little bit easier. While I'm in the storyboard and changing the background, let's fix a few other things as well. We wanted the message to pass between these two view controllers. So I'm going to go in here and say I have a button in the new view controller, in the pop view controller, and this one, it actually has maybe a white background, and it says send message. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set all the constraints for it. So I'm going to say add all missing constraints, and then I'm going to go ahead and say there is a label in here, and this is the one that's going to receive the message. So I'm going to place the label in here, say my label is a bit larger, and it also has a white background. And now I have to set the outlets for both of these items, and I also have to set the delegation pattern for them. So I'm going to go in here and say in my main view controller, this is my label. So this is called my label. In my other view controller, in the pop view controller, I'm going to go ahead and say this one is actually an action that says send message action. So then I'm going to go to the pop view controller and say up in here I actually have a protocol. I usually put this in a separate file, but it doesn't really matter in here. So I'm going to say pop action delegate, and it only has one function that says send message, and the message of it has an imp text, which is a string, of course. And since it is in the protocol, we don't need the body of the function. And now my pop view controller, it has a delegate. So I'm going to go ahead and say variable delegate of the type pop action delegate. And every time that the send message is called, do this. Say self.delegate.send message, and the message says from pop, just like what we have done many times before with the delegation patterns. So now this view controller and this protocol essentially are ready to send a message through the delegation. The only thing is left for me to do is go to my view controller. In here, when I find the VC of the type pop view controller, I'm going to say vc.delegate becomes self. And since I'm trying to delegate this view controller as this kind of delegation, I need to make sure that this thing is also there. Pop action delegate is one of the protocols we are conforming to. So my view controller conforms to that as well. And then it's telling me that if you are trying to conform to this, you must include that function. And that function is called, I think, send message. And I'm going to say every time you receive a message, show it on my label. So my label.text becomes input text, whatever value you find from whoever has called the delegation. Now, before I run the application, I want to quickly change something else as well. And that is, I want to come in here and say, where we see the source rectangle, I want it to be at the center. So my button.center.x, and for the y of it, I want it to be my button.center.y. I want it to show right at the bottom of my button, and then I want to push it down maybe as much as maybe half of the height, or any other number that you can just manually place in there. I don't want it to appear on top of my button, because right now when we press it, it actually appears right at the bottom of it, and I want it to appear down in here and not in the center like the last time. So with that in mind, if we go ahead and we rerun our application, we should have it appearing right at the bottom of the button, and it should actually interact with the view as well. So if I go here and I zoom a little bit, if I pop, it appears here, and then if I tap the send message, it sends a message to here, which is essentially the goal of having a popover view controller, controlling something in here. So that's almost about it, how to have a popover controller and how to communicate between the two of them. There is one other thing that I'm just going to show you. I'm not going to really do it because it doesn't work on this application, and that is something that we call controller.bar button item. And you use this essentially instead of using a source rect if you are going to call your controller from a bar button item from your navigation bar or from your button bar. If you want your controller to appear from a certain bar button item, then you call this one, which essentially overrides the source rect and makes sure that your controller shows up from that particular item on your bar. And that's useful in situations where you're using a navigation bar or something of the source. So that's about it. Let's keep it up to here, and we'll move on to our next lesson.